thanks for Socialist Resistance for inviting me, for Norman for that very interesting history from the perspective of the unity movement. So I want to fast forward now a couple decades and really talk to the very exciting political developments that have taken place since the crisis in South Africa, and particularly since the massacre of the mine workers in 2012. I was giving this report to the Fourth International Council just a couple of weeks ago in Amsterdam, and I managed to talk for well over an hour on these topics, such as the extent of the realignment and things that we've seen. So I'm going to try and be a lot more disciplined today and stick to 15, 20 minutes. But that will mean, unfortunately, that I'm going to presume that there's a little bit of familiarity and background information on the country. But if there's anything kind of left unsaid, hopefully we can clarify at the end of the discussion. So I want to focus on three main developments that have occurred. Firstly, the rise of the economic freedom fighters, which is the first sort of leftward split from the ANC. The kind of rightward consolidation that we've seen in the ANC in the last couple of years. And then to end on a slightly hopeful note, I want to talk about the splits in the union movement with the metal workers and the formation of this United Front for Socialism. So to just start with a few words of background on South African post-apartheid political economy and the nature of the crisis in South Africa, we can think of the post-apartheid period being characterized by the ongoing domination of the minerals energy complex, which is a term that comes from Ben Fine, who's here at SOAS, in which he uses to characterize the South African industrialization as determined and dominated by these major conglomerates rooted in mining, but also came to dominate the finance sector and wide sections of South African economy, which through their links to the state and the linkages with other industries kind of determined the entire accumulation path in the country. It gave us this very distorted industrial structure rooted in mining with massive unemployment. And it was really the drive of these sectors to financialize and to globalize the South African economy, to participate in global neoliberal revolution that was the ANC's sort of free market policy was designed to facilitate this. And you would know that we had this elite transition in South Africa where the kind of social democratic dream kind of died very quickly, and we had this very stringent Washington consensus type economic policy imposed by the new ANC government. And this was very effective in ensuring massive profitability in the South African economy, increasing the rate of exploitation in Marxist terms. A lot of our statistics suggest that big South African corporations have been amongst the most profitable in the world. We've seen the doubling of the economy-wide profit rate. But this hasn't translated into any real investment in the productive sector. So instead we've had enormous growth of the financial sector in terms of profit and value added, massive diversion of non-financial corporations away from real investment towards speculation and financial activities. And then we've had this enormous systemic looting of the country, essentially, half through kind of legal repatriation of profit and corporations moving abroad, but also massive illegal capital flight, amounting to 12% of GDP on average in the early 2000s. So you can imagine, a tenth of the value produced in the country moving off its borders illegally. And as a result of that, the economies remain concentrated in these traditional minerals energy complex sectors, and there's been a little bit of job creation around kind of more precarious work in retail and service and various other things, but we've had absolutely no dent in the so-called triple crisis in South Africa, which is firstly an unemployment rate that has stagnated around 37%, poverty at around 54%, and a Gini coefficient which is purported to be the largest of any large nation in the world, around 0.66, so the most unequal large nation on the planet. And this has been secured through the emergence of a new hegemonic bloc, which was firstly developed through the ANC's transformation into a kind of state party machine, this real penetration into the South African state, the creation of a tiny black elite through policies of black economic empowerment, which were implemented in place of any kind of substantive nationalization or redistribution. So this was really mainly done in the mining and the finance sectors, just introducing a small black elite into corporate boardrooms, them very linked to the elite that's been created in the state, and this group leading a kind of wider middle class layer, mainly based in public sector work and business related to the state. And this is the kind of core that I think the ANC, the kind of core class bloc, that has become hegemonic in the ANC, and that has secured the loyalty and the hegemony of the wider working class really through the role of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, and the South African Communist Party in the Tripartite Alliance. But it's important to say that this has been something that's been guaranteed really through the political co-optation and bureaucratization of the union movement. And I stress this because I think it's very important in understanding the current crisis. A lot of our recent research has been trying to dispel this quite pervasive myth that the trade union movement in South Africa, despite the fact that it has been politically defanged through its alliance, this corporatist alliance with the ANC, that it's been able to lead this very militant shop floor struggle in defense of a kind of insider layer of formal sector workers that has created a kind of labor aristocracy in the country. And that's a pervasive narrative that you hear from capital, from the business press, but also from progressives and from left-wing academics, and it's simply really not true. We've actually seen a complete erosion of the quite powerful traditions of worker democracy and worker control that existed in the union movement in the 80s, the total co-optation of unions into the state and into business, and actually very low levels of industrial action and completely stagnant wages for most workers. I can talk a bit about that later. So this was a situation in 2008 when the global crisis struck. And South Africa was amongst the worst affected developing nations. We lost more than 1 million jobs between the onset of the crisis in 2008 and 2010, and we've only just begun to recover that work. So South African capital was more or less entirely effective at passing off the costs of the crisis onto labour. And their initial kind of rebellion against us was suppressed in the first years through basically a project of false consciousness around the Soccer World Cup. And they managed to kind of pretend this was going to be the sort of panacea, and this would bring all the foreign investment that had been promised, and the kind of unrest was contained, was sort of left simmering until the unrest began on the mining sector in 2012. And this started at another mine run by Impala Platinum, and then spread to Marikana, where most of you would be, I hope, just a little bit familiar with the events that took place, the massacre of 34 mine workers by the police and brutal repression that followed that. So I'm not going to talk in any detail about the massacre, so we can go into that a bit at the end. Just to talk about the significance of it, there's a fantastic quote from Ruth First, a very famous Communist Party journalist in South Africa who was killed by apartheid. She was describing the 1946 rebellion of the mine workers in South Africa, and she called it one of these great historic incidents that in a flash of illumination educates a nation, reveals what has been hidden, destroys lies and illusions. And Marikana was almost incredible for the way it kind of crystallized all these major contradictions of the post-apartheid period that I just described here. The National Union of Mine Workers was probably the most co-opted of the South African unions. Its leadership was paid directly by the mines. Its shop stewards had been literally brought into the human resource departments of the mining companies. And nothing is more symbolic than all of this than the personal trajectory of that mine worker's founder, Cyril Ramaphosa. A radical in the 80s, joined the ANC, headed up its negotiations in the mid-90s as a Secretary General for a while, and then left and became the second richest and perhaps the most prominent black businessman in the country. And at the time of the massacre was the largest shareholder in Lonmin, the British-based mining company that these workers were rebelling against. And as was revealed by the Commission of Inquiry subsequently, it was his direct influence over the police commission and over ANC chiefs in the province that was responsible for directing the police to break the strike in the most brutal manner. He was, as became known, the butcher of Marikana. So this is kind of, Marikana was so symbolic of this ongoing domination of a minerals energy complex in South Africa, now based on new allegiances with a black elite in the state, whilst workers were living in literally conditions that had been unchanged in 150 years of mining in the country. And its immediate consequence was, of course, a massive labour rebellion. The National Union of Mine Workers lost all its members in platinum and a lot of other sectors in gold. And there was this incredible strike taken up, workers picking up the spear for the demand of a living wage, and organized in the mining sectors by organic worker committees. They joined at the time a small splinter union known as AMCU, which I can talk about a little bit at the end, but in the actual strike that occurred immediately afterwards, this was really run by workers themselves. And that strike split immediately then, quite incredibly, to the farm workers sector in the Western Cape, which is perhaps the most exploited sector in South Africa, where we have farm workers who are literally living in kind of feudalistic conditions. There is absolutely no union representation, no application of the meager labour laws that exist in the country, and absolutely out of nowhere there had been literally sort of no struggle from farm workers, and again kind of self-organised through organic workers committees using WhatsApp and various things to lead this incredible struggle across an entire very dispersed region, blocking roads in order to prevent the transportation of goods and workers to the farms. Brutal response from the police, 3 people killed, but able to win an increase in the minimum wage in the sector of 100%. And the rebellion continued on from here into the manufacturing sector, transport sector, into 2013 during the wage bargaining season, where we saw massive strikes across the economy, and continued again into 2014, where by June we saw the end of the longest ever strike in South Africa's mining history. 70,000 platinum workers continuing the struggle for a living wage, and winning increases at sort of twice the inflation rate. So now to talk about some of the political realignments that have taken place on the basis of this. This was firstly the conditions for the rise of what I called earlier the first kind of leftward split from the ANC, the economic freedom fighters led by Julius Malema, who became famous as the firebrand leader of the ANC Youth League, was at the time, 2008-2009, a critical ally of President Zuma. Himself a guy who's kind of spent his entire life in the ANC. He's a consummate demagogue, an incredible populist, by far and away the best political orator I've seen in the country, an absolute master of the soundbite of kind of his media imagery, and someone with a seemingly powerful kind of intuition for the mass sentiment, and particularly for the mass discontent and anger of the huge black unemployed urban youth in South Africa. And he, during his time in the ANC, became the kind of expression of that anger, and eventually, for various reasons, came into conflict with President Zuma and was expelled in 2011, I think. And then in 2012, after the massacre, he was literally the first politician on the ground. He'd spent a little bit of time off the scene in the wilderness. Suddenly he re-emerges. He goes to the mine workers, and he sort of starts this political process, and a year later, in 2013, the economic freedom fighters are launched at Marikana, based mainly on people, the kind of more radical elements that came out of the Youth League with him, along with a few of also the younger and more radical parts of the Communist Party, and then collecting a whole kind of composite, variegated social layer, a lot of radical community leaders, some of them also ANC Youth League people, people from sort of black consciousness movement, and also, frankly, a lot of less pleasant elements, people that had been responsible in the townships for leading the horrific bouts of xenophobic violence that we'd seen a couple of years earlier that had killed 70 people and displaced tens of thousands. So he leads this quite incredible political process of forming the economic freedom fighters, again generating a lot of power through his incredible command of the media. I mean, even the name Economic Freedom Fighters was quite a kind of genius device. It was very effective in situating them, continuing within the kind of ANC Congress tradition and saying we are now the ones who are actually taking forward the second stage of the revolution that had been continually promised by the Communist Party. And Malema goes from being, I mean, when he was in the ANC, when he was in power in Limpopo, he was a completely corrupt figure, as well as being a kind of radical nationalist. He was, involved in all sorts of tender corruption. He's just been now got a bill from the revenue services for 18 million rand. But he was very effective at this point in this kind of transitioned his image from wearing these purple Versace suits to donning a red beret, which has become the symbol of the economic freedom fighters. And again, is a kind of, the official ideology of the economic freedom fighters is Marxist, Leninist, Fananism. But depending on who they talk to, it's a very kind of subtle rhetoric that changes quite a lot, from a very radical black consciousness type of thing to now more and more consciously class register, class grammar, and then occasionally even sort of social democratic if that's the audience he needs to appeal to. But undoubtedly incredibly effective. This new organization formed with very little money, building in a matter of months to win 1.1 million votes in the election that took place last year. And initially criticized by a lot on the left as being a kind of electoralist thing and something that was just about reconstituting a support base for this populist character Malema, but it's something actually a lot more complicated than that. And even though the focus when it initially emerged was very much about getting into, was about succeeding in the elections, they clearly have no sort of electoralist fantasies. And the EFF has been very much present in the continuing tides of social protests that have taken place in South Africa. And even within Parliament, they've had this quite incredible strategy, which looks, like it could even have come out of a Leninist playbook of really delegitimizing the parliament. I mean, what they talk about is raising the contradictions of the street into the parliament. So they go into parliament wearing not the usual suits that the ANC politicians are wearing, but red overalls, or the outfits that domestic workers wear in South Africa for the female parliamentarians. And a small block of 25 members has succeeded in causing absolute chaos. They have been removed now 3 or 4 times. The latest incident during the State of the Nation address, in which they came through on long-standing promises to completely disrupt Zuma's address by shouting, pay back the money, in reference to enormous corruption charges that he's been involved in. And they were removed by 50 or so plainclothes policemen, while the ANC established a jammer in the parliament to block signals going out so that people couldn't be sending images of this thing. So there's a quite incredible strategy that they've been undertaking over there. And there's been a big debate on the left. A lot of people, because of the kind of authoritarian past of Malema and characters, have said that this is a form of proto-fascism. I think that's completely ridiculous. I don't think the fascist category makes any sense within South Africa. And I think most of us in the DLF and others have been insistent on saying that we need to see the EFF very much as a process of something that's been able to give political expression to an enormous basis of unrest in South African townships, where nobody before had succeeded in this. As I suggested, it's full of all different kinds of layers and uneven consciousnesses and different political ideologies, and it absolutely makes sense for progressives to be working at least somehow amongst the grassroots layers of the EFF, even if we cannot, I think, as some other comrades in the DLF, I think, have made a mistake of being a little bit uncritical about what Malema himself and his close people in what they call the War Council, I think is the name. The other thing is the EFF has a lot of militaristic imagery. I mean, Malema himself is referred to as the commander-in-chief. So we need to be very realistic about what he himself represents, but it's definitely a very interesting process that I think progressives need to be part of. So just quickly then, what's happened to the ANC since the massacre? Well, a few months afterwards they had their congress in which Zuma was elected virtually uncontested as president, and none other than the butcher of Marikana, Cyril Ramaphosa, was elected to the deputy presidency of the ANC. So that's of course absolutely symbolic of their kind of rightward consolidation in front of this massive labour rebellion, in front of these huge leftward fragmentations. There's been a desire to actually cleave closer to big business and to demonstrate their commitment to the continuation of a neoliberal program. And also symbolic of that was the decision by this Congress to ram through the acceptance of a national development plan, which was written up by the famous neoliberal finance minister Trevor Manuel, and his deputy in the planning commission was actually the same Cyril Ramaphosa, the ubiquitous butcher of Marikana. And this was essentially a document that's this ridiculous 500-page thing that gives a 30-year plan for the government that nobody really listens to, except for the economic section. The economic section is really to insist that we continue this program of wage squeezing, export-led growth. And it was, actually let me talk a little bit quickly about the, so we've had Zuma's continuing domination of the ANC. We've had a Zumarization of the party since then. It's really what's being revealed to us now in quite shocking fashion. Quite sadly, actually, because when Zuma took over from the previous president, Thabo Mbeki, a lot of people said, for all his faults, at least he has a slightly more democratic character. And what we're realizing is that that couldn't be further from the truth. Zuma himself comes out of the very Stalinist security service apparatus of the ANC. He was the kind of leader of the secret service, Mbokodo, for many years. And what's happened, as is being revealed, is that he has essentially stacked the state, all areas of the state, judiciary, everywhere, with very wide patronage networks that are having a very corrosive effect on the institutions of bourgeois democracy in South Africa, and really quite terrifying. We're seeing the growing involvement of the security cluster and the spying apparatus in factional battles and in the repression of these emerging kind of left opposition. So just quickly talk about the ANC, the election. The ANC was still able to win, despite its growing opposition, a substantial majority, 62.5% or something. I mean, on the one hand, we need to be very frank about what this symbolizes, that ANC's kind of hegemony isn't going to disappear overnight. On the other hand, there are a lot of mitigating factors around this. There were much lower participation rates in the election, is the first thing. A lot of the vote they were able to, so actually they got, in absolute terms, they got a lower number of votes. A lot of what they were able to hold on to had to do with their absorption of kind of Zulu national traditional parties in the rural areas, and really that's where the support base has been maintained. And very important in that has been the ability of the ANC to use the state resources, and in particular the welfare system, to mobilize support, to literally go out to rural areas and say, look, if we don't get back into power, you're going to lose your social grants, which directly support 17 million South Africans. So there's a whole bunch of circumstances that suggest that the ANC's support is still there, but it's a lot more fragile than that election result might suggest. So very quickly to talk, last thing, sorry, on the I've probably gone way over. On the exciting movements in the unions. So already by sort of 2011, 2012, in the midst of this crisis, we started to see some fragmentation in COSATU and a kind of more vocal opposition emerging to the ANC government, led by these left sections of the Secretary General, a man by the name of Vavi, and the Metal Workers Union. And initially there the slogan was demanding what they called a Lula moment from Zuma, which refers to Lula from Brazil, his second term in office, where he supposedly had this kind of left turn. And then it was really, of course, Marikana and the labor rebellion that followed that was the thing that really split these fissures open. So immediately after the massacre, you had the Communist Party and the rights within the Union of Mine Workers and the right within COSATU calling actually for increased repression of the mine workers' struggle, for the militarization of the area, and for communists to kind of support the repression of workers. And from that point already, you had the mine workers refusing to go along with this line and marching separately from the SACP and calling for support for the metal workers' struggle. And then from there, those kind of contradictions developed. Once the ANC accepted the National Development Plan at its 2012 Congress and elected Ramaphosa, the National Union of Mine Workers came out more or less into open opposition and said that their continued participation in the alliance must be contingent on the ANC scrapping this development plan and implementing the Freedom Charter as it had promised to do decades ago. At its Congress, it then takes a decision to start the formation of a United Front for Socialism in late 2013. And then very shortly afterwards, this sort of left Secretary General is expelled from the union under kind of charges of some very dodgy things he did with a junior staff member. And then there's a kind of immersion of really two factions within the union movement. NUMSA leading the one with 7 other unions that are starting to demand a special Congress in order to resolve the battles in the union, and are demanding that the COSATU now look elsewhere from the ANC for its political home and begin the development of a movement for socialism. And then eventually NUMSA itself is expelled from the union, from COSATU. And it's just this December, has launched this United Front for Socialism, which is obviously an incredibly important development in South African politics. For many on the left, this has always been kind of looked forward to as the kind of second coming. You know, we were always sort of very aware that because of the nature of the ANC dominance, really the formation of any kind of mass alternative was contingent on the union movements being able to accept a political alternative. So undoubtedly this has generated enormous enthusiasm around the world for the potential involved in this process, and I would absolutely support that. I mean, there are incredible opportunities that could come out of this thing, but it's also, it's not it's not that we're going to have a kind of radical socialist movement falling from the skies and all of this. We need to be quite critical about the elements that are involved in this process. We need to be quite aware of the fact that it is going to be a long process of building up the basis for unity amongst workers that have been trapped in a Stalinist corporatist alliance for 20 years with the ANC, have been totally alienated from the social struggles that have been taking place in the country, and so there's a lot of political work ahead of us, but I think we are very excited. So, okay.